Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. This is the premium wagon vise that I use. I think it's the best for the job that it does. I'm going to walk you through the entire process of how we install it, talk to you about the vise, give you everything you need to know. So a good vise is probably what makes or breaks any bench. You have to have a means of holding your work securely. So obviously the main function of this tail vise is to hold your work when you're planing so that it doesn't move around. It's well supported to the bench and it makes it easy to do the job of planing the surface. There's three different choices mostly. One is the traditional tail vise. Now I don't have an example of it here, although I built one before, and that's kind of an L-shaped affair. But it takes a long time to build. It's very susceptible to wood movement, and you really can't apply any downward pressure on this end of it. Then there's the standard vise that you just attach to the bottom side, and it's fine. It's really easy to attach. However, there's some limitations. Your piece is working over here under unsupported area, and you can get by with it. What I like about this one is the fact that your work piece, with the exception of that little gap, which is kept down to a minimum, it's just 2 inches, your workpiece is always supported all the way around. You have access to your entire bench. There's no weak points. And we actually use a double start thread, and I'll talk to you about that later. But this is really convenient, a relatively simple build. I'm going to walk you through that. So if you're looking at building a traditional style bench, I would suggest that you take a serious look at this style of a vise for your tail vise. Really good. Now, before I get into the actual construction of it, I want to show you exactly how I use this. All of my joinery work typically is done down here on the shoulder vise, so this one is reserved almost exclusively for planing surfaces, whether it's a wide panel or sometimes even up on an edge, but most typically it's laying down. As I mentioned this double start earlier, it's really fast, so I have a large selection of bench dog holes. I keep them close together in this area, which is most parts that you're going to be working with are somewhere around 2 feet or less. As they get a little farther apart as you go down the way. I actually have 2 bench dogs in here, although I don't use this one very often, but it's there if I need it. Pull the bench dog up, keep it down below the surface. It doesn't take much pressure. I always give it a little tap at both ends, and the dog holes are actually canted toward each other, so when you tap it down, it holds it tight and it doesn't pop up on you. And now it's just, for me, it's at the perfect height for planing. Holds it really securely, and it's just fantastic. Have nothing I don't like about it. There's no changes that I would make. Now, there's a couple of little trade-offs. In order to make it an easier build, the the rod is right behind the bench dog. So when you unwind it, it brings your rod out here, your handle out here. But I'm typically not walking around this side anyway, so it's not like it's in my way. There are other versions that actually have a nut on the outside of this movable dog strip. And this is offset as well, so you're moving it here and this is sliding, and that stays in one place, doesn't move in and out. But I don't think the trade-off is worth it. As I mentioned, there's 2 bench dogs on here. When I built it, I thought I might need it, but I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've ever used that. You've got quite a bit of capacity, and I like that one right up front. So that's how I use it. Now, I'll show you real quick. If you do need to have something standing on its end, you do the same way. Put that in place. Give it a tap on both ends, and now you can go ahead and plane, nice and solid, no movement. The single biggest advantage to our wagon wheel vise hardware is this double start thread. Here, I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm going to move this open to 1 inch. So to close or to move this 1 inch, I'm going to go 1 revolution, 2 revolutions, and it's shut. Now come over here, and we'll do the same thing on this one. In order to close the 1 inch gap, 1, 2, 3, 4. So half the amount. Some I've even seen there are as many as 6 or 7 revolutions. Now, It takes away a little bit of the force, but that's all right because most people put way too much pressure on their vices. All I need this to do is to hold it in place so that it doesn't move on me when I'm planing. Well, that doesn't take much more than a couple of pounds of pressure on that handle. And to be able to get that to move, remember also that rarely are you moving this any more than 2 inches at any given time. So it's just a couple of whips of that handle and you're in place. It's a nice big thread, a big rod, and we did that more for looks rather than a little spindly one. I like this big honking thing. You've got a nice great big nut, brass nut in here so it moves nice and smoothly. It's all polished up, which not that that matters, but it certainly looks nice. And it's easy to mount. There's not a whole lot to it. It's very simple, but it's well machined. There's no slop in the threads in that brass nut. It really is nicely done. We actually have them made by a friend of mine up in Ontario. Now there's a movable dog strip. This is the piece right here. I didn't cut the dog holes in it, but that's not hard to figure out. And this is real simple. So there's two pieces, or one piece split in half, and that squeezes these two pieces of maple. And these pieces of maple are designed to fit in the slots. So this is your outside piece. That slot has a really nice close fit with that piece of maple so that it doesn't allow it to move up and down when you're opening and closing it. This simply squeezes this piece in here. It's not fastened any other way, but just the fact that there's a couple of lag bolts in there that squeezes these two pieces and keeps them attached to this movable dog strip. Now when you cut these, you have to make sure that the distance from here to the slot is the same on this piece. This is the centerpiece of your bench. Now, I'm just going to take this out, and we can back these screws out. All of the force, when this is being used, is pushing this piece in that direction, so you don't need much more than a couple of screws to hold this flange. And I don't turn that flange around and bury this portion of it in here because you're so close to the end of the end cap, there'd be no material left. Now, you sacrifice a little bit of travel in there, but as I mentioned, rarely do you ever use this thing or move this thing more than 2 or 3 inches at a time, so it's not a big deal. Take that off, and that's just for looks. This is an 1.5 inch hole. Could be a little bit bigger just to make it a little, give it a little more space, but it's not a big deal. Here's your center section. Now the way we put these together is use 3 splines, and this is cross-grain construction. This is going to move like this doesn't, so you have to make sure that when you put it together that you're not gluing these in. Now I do glue the first couple of inches, and I put a couple of lag bolts right here because you never want the movement of the bench to come this way. If it closed down this gap, it's going to jam up your bench, your dog strip. So all of the movement has to go that way, and you build that into your bench. But there's your, when I cut that slot, at the same time I cut the slot in this one so that it's equal distance from the top. That's really simple. You can put a dovetail or whatever you want in the end of your end cap. You want to keep that hole in the middle of this space. And I try to keep this as narrow as possible, meaning I don't want this gap to be any wider than it needs to be. I've got that 2 inches. So if you measure the nut, it's just under. It's 1 inch and 15 sixteenths. And the one on the other end is also 1 inch and 15 sixteenths. And you could, if you wanted to, you could even grind a little more off of that. But 2 inches is not a big gap. So that's as simple as it is. Of course, when you're building it, it's a little more complicated because you got great big pieces, not little tiny ones. But that's an exploded view of how it goes together. And probably the biggest mystery is how you hold these pieces in place. And that allows you, remember, you have to assemble this after this has all been put together. So you can put this piece down from the top, you put this piece up from the bottom, and then you put the bolt in, and that squeezes it in place, and it's held securely. This gets fastened to the underside or the inside of the end cap, and this piece has to drop down from the top so that you can again install it after it's already assembled. That comes down from the top, and once it's in place, you just have 2 screws. I actually, just to clean it up, I put another piece of bird's eye maple actually, that covered this end, and I have the same thing over here. And then you're just going to fasten that like so, top and bottom. A little bit of grease in there doesn't hurt. Makes it move a little bit smoother. And then you've got a great, easy to build wagon wheel style tail vise that I've had this now since 2011 or 2012, and there's no slop, there's no wear to speak of. And I put a little bit of wax on that every once in a while just to keep it moving nice and smooth, but serves me well. Hope this helps. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the plane and chisel icon below, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our in-person and online workshops.